Part 5. 2 years later, Mary stood in front of a large room at Royal Hospital. Today was special. The Equal Care program was celebrating its success. Hospital staff, restaurant workers, and community members filled every seat. 2 years ago, Mary began, I made a terrible mistake. I judged someone based on how they looked. I thought they weren't important. That mistake changed my life. The audience listened quietly. Many knew Mary's story now. It had become famous in the city. Today, over 50 restaurants and 5 hospitals use our training programs. Thousands of workers have learned to see each person as equally deserving of respect and care. Mary looked around the room and saw James Wilson sitting in the back. He smiled at her. Beside him sat Dr. Brown from Royal Hospital. I want to share some good news, Mary continued. Patient satisfaction at Royal Hospital has improved by 40%. Restaurant customer complaints are down by 30%. These numbers matter, but the real success is in the stories. Mary pointed to a screen behind her. Pictures appeared showing restaurant staff and hospital workers with customers and patients. Peter from Oakfields helped an elderly man who couldn't read the menu. He spent an hour reading every item aloud. The audience clapped as Peter stood up, smiling shyly. Nurse William from Royal Hospital stayed after his shift to translate for a family who didn't speak English well. He made sure they understood their father's care plan. Nurse William waved as people clapped for him. These are the real successes, Mary said. Small moments of seeing people clearly and treating them with dignity. After the celebration, Mary met with James and Dr. Brown in a small office. We have something to tell you, James said. Dr. Brown and I have been talking. We want to expand the program nationally. We're creating a new organization called Equal Treatment Foundation. Mary was surprised. Nationally? That's amazing. Dr. Brown nodded. Yes, and we want you to lead it. Mary couldn't speak for a moment. Me? But I haven't even finished nursing school yet. You'll finish next month, James reminded her. And no one understands this work better than you do. Mary thought about her journey. From a waitress who insulted a customer to the leader of a national program, it seemed impossible. This isn't what I planned, she said slowly. I always thought I'd work as a nurse in a hospital. You will help more people this way, Dr. Brown said. You'll change how thousands of healthcare workers treat their patients. Mary looked at James. None of this would have happened if you had just fired me that day. James smiled. I saw something in you worth saving, and look what you've built. With that second chance. 3 months later, Mary stood in her new office at the Equal Treatment Foundation. Pictures hung on the wall, the restaurant where it all began, the hospital where the program expanded, and table 7 where she had insulted James Wilson years ago. Mary's assistant knocked on the door. Your first team meeting starts in 5 minutes. Everyone's here. Mary nodded. Thank you, I'll be right there. Before leaving her office, Mary looked at a small frame on her desk. Inside was a note James had given her at her nursing school graduation. It said, What matters is not the mistakes we make, but what we learn from them. You have learned well. Mary smiled and walked to the meeting room. 20 eager faces looked up at her. They were the first trainers for the national program. Welcome, Mary said. I'm going to tell you a story about a mistake I made and how it changed everything. Part 1. James Wilson walked into the courtroom with his head held high. His expensive suit and shiny shoes showed everyone that he had lots of money. As the owner of Wilson Properties, he had bought more buildings in the city than anyone else. He never smiled at people he thought were less important than him. Judge Elizabeth Brown sat behind her large wooden desk. She was known for being fair and smart. She had worked hard her whole life, starting in a poor part of the city. Now at 50 years old, she was one of the most respected judges in town. Her black robe was perfectly pressed, and her eyes were sharp and clear. All rise for Judge Brown, called out the court officer. Everyone stood up. Everyone except James Wilson. He kept checking his gold watch and tapping his foot. Mr. Wilson, Judge Brown said in a calm voice, in my courtroom, everyone stands when asked to. James looked up with a smirk on his face. Of course, Your Honor. Sometimes I forget these little rules. His voice was full of disrespect as he slowly got to his feet. The courtroom was very quiet. People looked at each other, surprised by his rudeness. "Mr. Wilson, these rules are the backbone of our legal system," Judge Brown said. "Everyone is equal under the law in this courtroom." "Equal?" James laughed. "Some might say that's not really true, wouldn't you agree, Judge Brown?" Gasps filled the room. Everyone knew what he was hinting at. The case was about how Wilson Properties had forced many poor families out of their homes to build fancy new flats. These families were now suing him. James thought he would easily win because he had expensive lawyers. During the first day of the trial, James kept interrupting people. He rolled his eyes when poor families told their stories. He whispered to his lawyers and laughed at the wrong times. "Your Honor," he said during one family's story, "can we speed this up? Some of us have important meetings to attend." Judge Brown looked at him calmly. "Mr. Wilson, every person in this courtroom deserves to be heard. Every family affected by your actions matters equally under the law." During a break, James was overheard in the hallway. "Who does she think she is? Some council estate girl telling me how to run my business?" He laughed with his lawyers. "This will be over soon. I know important people." What James didn't know was that Henry Miller, an older man sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, was listening carefully. Henry had been the caretaker at James's primary school 30 years ago. He remembered a very different James, a small boy who was kind and always said thank you. As James continued to act badly in court, Judge Brown stayed professional. She had faced men like him throughout her career, first as a young lawyer, then as a prosecutor, and now as a judge. But she never let it change how she treated people or her belief in fairness. That evening, Henry waited outside the courthouse. When James walked out, Henry stepped forward. "Hello, James," he said quietly. "You probably don't remember me." James looked annoyed at first, then surprised. "Mr. Miller?" "Yes," Henry said. "I've been watching you in court today. The boy I knew would never have acted this way." James's face changed. For just a moment he looked ashamed. "That boy is long gone," James said, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. "I don't think so," Henry replied. "I think he's still in there somewhere." As James drove away in his expensive car, Judge Brown happened to walk by. She had seen the exchange but hadn't heard the words. She wondered what had made the arrogant man look so uncomfortable. The real test would come tomorrow, when the most important witness would take the stand. An elderly woman named Margaret Thompson, who had lived in the same flat for 50 years, before James's company forced her out. What no one knew was that Margaret had once been James's nanny, and she had stories to tell that would change everything. The end part. The second day of the trial started with a buzz in the courtroom. Everyone had heard about James Wilson's rude behavior towards Judge Brown. People whispered as he walked in, but something was different today. James was quieter. He still wore an expensive suit, but his usual smirk was gone. When Judge Brown entered, James stood up right away. She nodded slightly, noticing the change. "Today we will hear from Margaret Thompson," said the lawyer for the families. Mrs. Thompson lived in Oakwood Flats for 50 years before Wilson Properties bought the building. An elderly woman with silver hair and bright eyes walked slowly to the front. James Wilson's face turned pale when he saw her. "Mrs. Thompson, do you know Mr. Wilson?" asked the lawyer. "Yes, I do," she said in a clear voice. "I was his nanny from when he was born until he was 12 years old." The courtroom filled with surprised whispers. Judge Brown looked at James, who was staring at his hands. "I worked for the Wilson family for many years," Margaret continued. "James was a sweet boy. He loved stories about brave people who helped others. His favorite was about a poor man who built homes for people who had nowhere to live." James looked up, his eyes showing a mix of shame and something else, perhaps memories of a time long forgotten. Margaret told the court how she had lived in Oakwood Flats since 1968. She described how Wilson Properties had sent letters telling everyone to leave, offering very little money. When people refused, the heating was turned off in winter. "Mrs. Thompson, why didn't you contact Mr. Wilson directly?" asked Judge Brown. "Given your history with him?" The little boy I knew would have helped us, Margaret said. But I wasn't sure if that boy still existed in the man he became. During the lunch break, James sat alone in a corner of the courthouse. Henry Miller, the former caretaker, sat down next to him. She still keeps that storybook, you know, Henry said. The one about the builder who helped people. How do you know that? James asked quietly. Margaret and I are friends. We both remember the kind boy you were. James rubbed his eyes. That was a long time ago. Not so long, Henry replied. People can change, James, but they can also remember who they truly are. Back in the courtroom, the family's lawyer showed pictures of the flats before and after Wilson Properties bought them. They showed old people moving out in the snow, children crying as they left the only homes they had known. When it was time for James's lawyer to speak, James suddenly stood up. Your Honor, may I say something? Judge Brown looked surprised but nodded. I want to speak for myself, James said. His voice was different now, less confident, more real. Mrs. Thompson, he said, turning to his former nanny, you taught me what was right. Somewhere along the way I forgot those lessons. The courtroom was completely silent. Your Honor, I want to change my plea. What my company did was wrong. I'm ready to make it right. Judge Brown studied him carefully. Mr. Wilson, are you saying you want to settle this case? Yes, James said. But more than that, I want to rebuild the flats, better ones, and let everyone move back at the same rent they paid before. Margaret Thompson smiled, tears in her eyes. There he is, she whispered. There's the boy I knew. Judge Brown called both lawyers to her desk. They talked quietly for several minutes. Court will adjourn until tomorrow morning, Judge Brown announced. Mr. Wilson and the lawyers will work out the details of a proposed settlement overnight. As people left the courtroom, James walked over to Margaret. I still have that book too, he said softly. It's in my office. I look at it sometimes and wonder where that boy went. He never left, Margaret said, patting his hand. He was just waiting for you to find him again. The end part. 3 James Wilson spent the night in his big, empty house thinking about Margaret's words. He looked at old photos of himself as a child, with his nanny. In one picture, little James sat on Margaret's lap while she read him his favorite story. He remembered how safe he had felt then. Morning came, and James arrived at the courthouse early. He sat on a bench outside, watching people walk by. Regular people with regular jobs. People he normally wouldn't even notice. Judge Brown spotted him as she arrived. She was surprised to see the wealthy businessman sitting alone, looking lost, in thought. Good morning, Mr. Wilson, she said politely. James stood up quickly. Good morning, Your Honor. May I speak with you for a moment? Not about the case, just person to person. Judge Brown hesitated, then nodded. Briefly. I wanted to apologize for my behavior, James said. It was disrespectful to you and to your courtroom. Judge Brown studied his face. May I ask what changed? Margaret and Henry, James replied. They reminded me of who I was before money became the only thing that mattered to me. Inside the courtroom, a different James Wilson stood before the judge. Gone was the arrogant businessman. In his place was a man who looked humbled. Your Honor, my lawyers have prepared a settlement agreement, James announced. But I'd like to explain it myself. Judge Brown nodded and James turned to face the families. I will rebuild Oakwood Flats, he said clearly. Better than before, with proper heating, new kitchens, and safe playgrounds. Everyone who was forced to leave can return paying the same rent they paid before. People in the courtroom began to whisper excitedly. Additionally, James continued, I will create a neighborhood fund of £5 million to be used however the community decides, for education, health care, or whatever the residents need. One of the mothers stood up. Why should we trust you now? She asked. You broke your promises before. It was a fair question. James nodded respectfully. You're right to doubt me, he said. That's why I'm asking Judge Brown to appoint a community board to oversee everything. They will have the final say, not me or my company." Judge Brown leaned forward. "Mr. Wilson, this goes far beyond what the law would require of you. Are you certain?" "I am," James replied. "It's not just about doing what's legal. It's about doing what's right." The judge called a short break to review the settlement terms. In the hallway, Margaret approached James. "I knew you would remember," she said, her eyes bright with pride. "I've wasted so many years," James admitted. "Building things that didn't matter, tearing down things that did. It's never too late to build something good," Margaret said. When court resumed, Judge Brown announced that she would accept the settlement with some additional conditions to protect the families. "This court will retain oversight of the project for 5 years," she declared. "Mr. Wilson will provide quarterly reports on progress." As people began to leave the courtroom, a young boy tugged on James's sleeve. It was Tommy, one of the children who had been forced to move. "Mister, does this mean we can go home?" he asked. James knelt down to the boy's level. "Yes, it does, and it will be better than before, I promise." "Can we have a football pitch?" Tommy asked hopefully. James smiled, really smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. "I think that could be arranged." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded James. They asked why he had changed his mind, why he had given up so much money, what his shareholders would say. James looked past them to where Margaret stood with Henry and some of the families. The answer was there in their faces. "Some things are worth more than money," he said simply. The end part. 6 months passed since the trial. The old Oakwood Flats building site buzzed with activity. Workers moved about, carrying materials and operating machinery. What had once been run-down flats was now taking shape as something new and better. James Wilson visited the site every Monday morning. Today he wore simple clothes, jeans and a work shirt, so different from his courtroom suits. He walked through the half-finished buildings, talking to the workers by name. "Morning, Jack. How's that west wing coming along?" he called to a carpenter. "On schedule, Mr. Wilson," Jack replied with a smile. "Those special windows for the elderly residents arrived yesterday." James nodded, pleased. He had insisted on extra-large windows for older residents who couldn't go outside as often. More light meant better health, the research showed. A small group waited for him near the community center frame, the first building nearing completion. It was the community board that Judge Brown had appointed. 5 residents, Margaret Thompson, Henry Miller, and a court representative named David. "James," Margaret greeted him warmly. "We've been reviewing the plans for the playground." They spread drawings on a makeshift table. The playground design showed swings, slides, and climbing frames, but also special equipment for children with disabilities. "Tommy asked if we could add basketball hoops," said Lisa, a mother of 3 who served on the board. "The older kids need something too." "Of course," James agreed quickly. "Let's put them here and here." He marked the spots on the plans. Working with the community board had changed James. He listened more than he spoke now. His ideas were still good, but he no longer assumed they were the only ideas that mattered. After the meeting, James walked with Margaret through the site. Construction noise surrounded them. Hammering, drilling, the beeping of trucks backing up. "Did you ever think we would be here?" James asked. Margaret smiled. "I always had hope for you, James, even when you seemed to lose your way." They reached the edge of the property where a large sign stood, "Oakwood Community, where everyone belongs." Below was a smaller line, "A Wilson Properties project in partnership with residents." "Judge Brown is visiting tomorrow," James said. "The quarterly review." "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked. James laughed. "Not anymore. She's been fair, tough but fair." The next day, Judge Elizabeth Brown arrived at the site wearing sensible shoes and carrying a clipboard. Her formal courtroom manner was gone, replaced by practical efficiency. "Mr. Wilson," she said with a professional nod. "Please, call me James now," he replied. They toured the site together, the judge taking notes and asking detailed questions about timelines and budgets. The community center was nearly finished, its large windows letting in streams of light. The families start moving back next month, James explained. We're ahead of schedule. And the community fund? Judge Brown asked. The board has allocated the first $1 million, James said. Education grants, healthcare support, and job training programs. They reached a bench overlooking the whole project. Judge Brown sat down, taking in the view. You've surprised me, Mr. Wilson, she admitted. When you first walked into my courtroom, I was a different person, James finished. Or perhaps I'd forgotten who I really was. People rarely change this completely, Judge Brown observed. James thought about this. I didn't change. I remembered. There's a difference. As they walked back toward the entrance, a school bus stopped nearby. Children poured out, led by teachers on a field trip to see their future homes. Tommy, now a bit taller, spotted James and ran over. Mr. Wilson, is our football pitch done yet? He asked eagerly. Next week, James promised. Want to help pick out the goals? Tommy's face lit up. Really? Can I? Judge Brown watched as the businessman and the boy walked away, deep in conversation. About football goals and team colors. She made one final note on her clipboard. Project exceeding expectations in all areas. Most impressive, the change in the man himself. Honorary the end part. 1 year had passed since the day James Wilson had stood in court and changed his life. Today was the grand opening of the new Oakwood community. Colorful ribbons decorated the entrance, and a large crowd gathered in front of the O Community Center. James stood nervously to the side watching people arrive. Families who had once been forced to leave now returned, their faces showing wonder as they saw their new homes. The buildings were beautiful, solid and well built, with green spaces between them and trees planted everywhere. Nervous? Asked Margaret, appearing beside him. At 83, she moved slower now, but her eyes were as bright as ever. A bit, James admitted. What if they still hate me? Give people a chance to see the real you, Margaret said. That's all anyone can ask for. The ceremony was set to begin at noon. Judge Elizabeth Brown arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a simple blue dress instead of her court robes. She nodded to James with something that almost looked like respect. Your quarterly reports have been excellent, she said. The court oversight will end 6 months early. Thank you, James said. But I'd still value your input if you're willing. The judge looked surprised. I would be. At exactly noon, the community board members cut the ribbon together, a row of different people from various backgrounds all holding the scissors as one. The crowd cheered as they stepped through into their new home. James had prepared a speech, but when he stood at the microphone, he put his notes away. A year ago, I stood in a courtroom as a man who had lost his way. He began simply. I had forgotten what truly matters. Thanks to some very wise people who remembered the boy I once was, I found myself again. He looked at Margaret and Henry, in the front row. This community isn't my gift to you, James continued. It's your gift to me. You taught me that buildings aren't just steel and concrete. They're the spaces where lives happen, where families grow, where people belong. Little Tommy, now the captain of the new youth football team, came forward with a large picture frame. Inside was the children's storybook that Margaret had read to James as a boy, the one about the builder who helped people. We found this, in your office, Tommy said. Mrs. Thompson said it should hang here so everyone can remember. James felt tears in his eyes as they hung the framed book in the community center entrance. Below it, a small plaque read, Remember who you are. After the speeches, people explored their new homes. The elderly residents discovered their special windows and easy-to-use kitchens. Children ran to the playground with its basketball courts and football pitch. Parents walked through flats with safe stairs and working heating. James walked among them, no longer the powerful businessman set apart, but just another person in the community. Some people still kept their distance, wounds not fully healed. Others thanked him, shook his hand, or invited him in for tea. Near the end of the day, Judge Brown found James sitting on a bench watching children play. You've done something remarkable. Here, she said, sitting beside him. I had good teachers. James replied. Including you. Me? The judge looked surprised. You showed me that true justice isn't just about laws, James explained. It's about making things right. As the sun began to set, casting golden light over the new buildings, Margaret joined them on the bench. What will you do now? She asked. James, he smiled. Wilson Properties has 20 other buildings across the city. I think they could all use the Oakwood treatment, don't you? Judge Brown raised her eyebrows. That's ambitious. I spent half my life tearing communities apart, James said. I'd like to spend the rest putting them back together. As they sat watching the new community come to life around them, James felt something he hadn't felt in years. True purpose. Not the empty drive for more money or more power, but the deep satisfaction of doing something that mattered. Sometimes, Margaret said softly, it takes losing your way to find a better path. The end.